I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and the Zell and Shirley Miller Library at Young Harris College. We're in the Paul Coverdell office building in the state capitol in Atlanta with our guest, former state representative and Senator Eric Johnson. Welcome, Senator, and thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be here, Bob.
You have had a long and successful career in Georgia politics, despite not being a native Georgian. Let's begin by talking about your early life, where you grew up, I believe, in Shreveport, Louisiana.
I did Saxby Chambliss, and I went to the same high school. He was 10 years older, so we didn't know each other. But born in New Orleans, raised in Shreveport.
And attended Tulane.
Yes, sir. Newt Gingrich, I think, had a stint at Tulane.
Right. And became an architect.
Yes, sir.
And then moved to Savannah, Georgia.
I did 1 year in Dallas, married a Savannah girl while I was still in school. That's how I ended up in Savannah.
How did you first get interested in politics in Georgia?
I actually just got interested as a way of meeting people, and but my wife and Libby Morris, now Libby Kingston, were good friends, and Jack Kingston and Libby were dating, weren't even married, and they asked me to go to a Young Republican meeting, and I went just as a way to meet some new people in Savannah. I still joke that if I'd have been invited to a Young Democrat meeting, it might have all turned out different.
But you have been a Republican. You were not a party switcher.
No, and my parents were not very political, but they voted. They're moderate Republicans. They're no longer with us. My first vote ever was I believe it was the first year 18-year-olds could vote, and I voted for Tricky Dick.
Mm-hmm. Well, you all worked your way up to become chairman of the local county party.
Mm-hmm. Young Republican was 1980 Young Republican of the Year. Right. Reagan Mattingly year.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about that. 1980, a very historic year for the Republican Party in Georgia, because that's when Senator Mattingly defeated Herman Talmadge, whose name was a household word throughout Georgia. You worked in that campaign.
I did. I was the YR chairman at the time, and nobody thought the IBM typewriter salesman from St. Simons could beat Talmadge, so none of the senior party people were getting active in that race, and they called and asked me to chair Chatham County, and I did, and we actually got to be pretty good friends. Of course, served 2 years on his staff, but I never thought he'd win. I didn't go to Atlanta for that big upset victory party. I was down in St. Mary's, Georgia on an architectural project, and somebody called me, and I still didn't believe him that he'd won. Because remember, all the papers had Talmadge winning the next day.
How do you think he pulled it off?
Cobb County. I think maybe it was a little bit about what's still going on today, a little bit of we want to change. There was the smell of the raincoat and the money and some of the scandal around Talmadge. And of course, Ronald Reagan being on top of the ticket didn't hurt at all. That's the other side of me being young. When I started involved in politics, never thought the Republicans would be the majority, but I wanted a two-party system. I wanted a debate of ideas. I wanted the competitiveness that a two-party system brought. It wasn't necessarily I was conservative or liberal, because back in the day, as you know, the Democrats were fairly conservative. Some would argue more conservative than the country club Republicans. So it was more about two-party system. But Reagan made me a true believer in policy and ideology.
So your work with Senator Mattingly actually steered you toward elective politics?
No, I still didn't think I was going to ever run. I did 2 years on his staff in the region, which helped me learn to speak to farmers and bankers and folks on welfare. It just gave me a good exposure to everyday people that I probably wouldn't have had. I hadn't served on his staff, but after 2 years, I figured I either had to move to Washington and make a career out of it or go back to architecture. So I went back to architecture and just started helping candidates like Jack Kingston run for office, and felt like I ended up with a knack of being able to put together strategy and write the position papers, and we did everything on a dining room table back then. So I felt the gift of being able to run campaigns, but still never thought I'd run myself.
But you decided to run, and you ran for the House of Representatives, I believe, in 1992.
Jack Kingston called me, said he was going to run for Congress. I said, well, good luck. You're not going to win that race. And he said, why don't you run for my seat? And I ended up deciding to do it, and nobody else qualified. So my first election was a state representative election with no opponent.
None.
That was a piece of cake.
None in the general election?
None in the general election. And it allowed me to help run Jack's campaign, which of course he won.
Do you remember the main political issues back then? Were they the same as they are today?
Well, there's always a liquor bill and a gun bill. I don't remember abortion being as big, or the social issues weren't as big back then. It was more about Tom Murphy and power in the one-party state. I had some good advice when I was first elected, and my father-in-law had been an old-time Republican, Democrat, Swiss Republican, was a delegate to the '64 Goldwater Convention in San Francisco. I still have some of those memorabilia. But people like him said, go sit down with Murphy and introduce yourself and tell him, who you are and what you want. And I did. And I still remember him asking me who you want to sit with the Republicans. I said, no, I want to sit with the Democrats. And he said, why do you want to do that? I said, because I want to learn how this place operates. So I sat next to Jimmy Skipper, who went on to be Majority Whip, and it's still a good friend. So Tom Bordeaux, people like that, helped me with the rules, helped teach me when it's okay to vote with your party and when the speaker's really watching. So the 2 years I had in the House were extremely valuable for me in learning the legislative process, and I learned it from Democrats, not Republicans.
Well, let's talk a minute about the speaker. 28 years he served, and he was the master of the House. He not only appointed the leadership, he appointed the committee chairman, he appointed the members of the committees. He even, as you said, decided where you sat.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't get along with the speaker, you would have a hard time making it in the House.
He made a break. I mean, he elected Joe Frank Harris. I mean, he determined sometimes who could be governor and sometimes who couldn't be governor.
Right. So you served in the House for just the one term.
Just one term, and I respected Tom Murphy a lot. I still believe, and we'll get to this in the Senate, that the presiding officer of a legislative body has to have the power to control that process. Otherwise, it's chaos. Otherwise, you have what's going on in the U.S. Senate now, and Congress now. Nobody's in charge, right. And nothing gets done. So I'm a firm believer in the presiding officer having power, which is why I gave it back to Casey Cagle after I had it until he was elected.
Right. We'll get to that. But I would like to ask you this. After serving a term in the House of Representatives, how was service in the Senate different?
In the House, you had to scream and shout to be heard. You had to be a character. You had to be flamboyant, funny, or very close to the speaker. I did pass a bill in the House, Mutiny in Prison Act, a small little bill, but I was being a good player, and I actually passed a bill as a freshman Republican. But the Senate is a smaller body. So I don't want to say that you have more power in it, but you have the ability to make friends, to work across the aisle. You don't have to shout to be heard. The intellect of the debate matters. And Pierre Howard was a more open, cooperative presiding officer than Tom Murphy was.
Mm-hmm. Well, as in most legislative bodies, the vetting of proposed legislation is done in committee. And on what committees in the Senate did you serve?
Oh, golly, I do not remember. I've served on a bunch of them. Of course, when I got into leadership, I was ex officio about all of them.
Right.
I remember serving with Paul Brown because I had served in the House Industries Committee, and I can't even remember the name of it, but it oversaw all of the authorities, including the Georgia Ports Authority, and Paul Brown was a great gentleman, unlike his son. But Paul Brown from the Athens area was a great mentor to me and very open. He didn't care what party you came from. That's the committee I remember the best. And then I was probably on some other minor committees. That was probably the economic development. I forget what the name of it was, but it was basically the economic development committee.
Zell Miller was lieutenant governor at the time.
I think so. So he ran. I can't remember when he was elected. I think Pierre Howard was lieutenant governor when I was elected. So that must have been the election that Zell was elected governor.
Okay, good. You became whip of your party.
Second term. Yeah,
Second term.
Pretty. Well, now there weren't a lot of us then. I don't remember, 11 or 12 maybe. But I had that political background, and I was eager. I wanted to be in a majority. I mean, there were some of the old horses that were just don't rock the boat, just get along, be quiet, don't speak up, and I was developing a little bit more firebrand, a little bit more aggressiveness in the process, and that got me to be whip. And I beat Sally Newbill.
Beat Sally?
Yeah, she didn't like that.
Then you became majority leader.
That was Chuck Clay had been our minority leader, and he was running for lieutenant governor, I believe, maybe an attorney general. I think he was running for lieutenant governor, stepped aside, so I moved up. And again, this is my third term, but it was just the right place at the right time, which has been a lot of my career.
And then President Pro Tem.
Yeah, there were a few elections between being minority leader and being Pro Tem.
Yeah. Explain to us. I'm curious, and I'm sure not everybody knows, the duties of a whip in a legislative body.
The whip is counting votes, and you have to be sensitive to folks to keeping it quiet. Leadership knows it, but you don't spread it. Somebody's going to vote this way or that way, and sometimes it's very awkward for them to all of a sudden have they're voting against the bankers, to have their local bankers call them. But it's basically counting votes to give sometimes mostly it's within your own party, but sometimes you're helping the presiding officer know whether to put something on the floor or not.
Let's talk a minute now about this. Before you became President Pro Tem of the Senate, which is actually the second most powerful position in the Senate, giving credit to the Lieutenant Governor for being the presiding officer. But I remember reading a very interesting account that you gave of yourself about being the new Eric after you became Pro Tem.
Yeah, you skipped over the whole old Eric part.
Well, I'm about to ask that question. You said you were the new Eric. Tell us about the old Eric.
Well, I talked about being a little bit more aggressive. When I became minority leader, the younger bucks in the House and in the party were beginning to say, maybe we can win this thing. So we began doing things like targeting seats rather than just giving, all the candidates are running, let's just give them all $100, whatever. And so we started targeting. We were much more aggressive on recruiting Much to the chagrin of the majority party, we were dropping amendments that were forcing some very tough votes for them that we could then use against them in the election. So it was, and then I had just have a sharp tongue and a sharp wit, and felt like using it. I remember one amendment I dropped. Zell Miller had a bill to put a classical CD in every cradle in Georgia because it was going to help them grow up, healthier or smarter or something. And I put an amendment, make sure they had 30 minutes of Rush Limbaugh on the same CD.
I also read once where someone referred to you as a bomb thrower. Do you plead guilty to that charge?
I do. I don't want to say I was modeling Newt Gingrich, but I had the same sort of style of not letting the majority party get away with it, and having learned in the House that sometimes you have to be a little bit more flamboyant or outrageous to get the coverage. We did it, and I wasn't shy about it. There were several, the Mike Egans and Clay Lands and Johnny Isaacson, and they were a quieter breed. They didn't necessarily mind what I was doing, but they weren't going to participate in it. So we were very aggressive in our politics.
And the new Eric?
Well, I found, Newt wrote a book about changing from minority leader to speaker called Lessons Learned the Hard Way, and it was out of print, and I found it on eBay and read it, and that was part of what he had learned, that when you shift from, there's a different role being in a minority than being in my case, basically virtually the lieutenant governor, that you have a different role to play. And you have to lead instead of, you have to make decisions. You can't just criticize on the other side. So I tried to be a different thing. Appointed 3 minority Democrat committee chairmen, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Let's develop that scene. What had happened was that the Senate had reached a Republican majority. The lieutenant governor, who was elected by the people, was presiding officer. You, as majority leader, in effect, became the most powerful senator.
Yeah,
how do you use that position effectively under those circumstances?
Well, it wasn't easy, but I had because you were a part-time legislator. I had a staff of at 3 at the time. I mean, I think normally the pro tem just had 1 or maybe an intern and a secretary. But I beefed it up with a chief of staff and an attorney and a secretary and a couple of interns, but still not what the lieutenant governor has. And I'm sitting on the front row now, and give credit to Tom Price, who was the majority leader, and in the transition period, he took charge of the rules and rewrote the rules to virtually shift. The Georgia Constitution says the lieutenant governor presides over the Senate. Everything, all the other power comes from the rules of the Senate. So we changed the rules of the Senate, which were only a majority vote on the first day of the session, so that we had a committee of 3, of which I led, that appointed committees. And then I was the parliamentarian. That was what made Mark Taylor the maddest, that he couldn't even bang the gavel and make a decision on parliamentary maneuvers. And we wrote a rule that says if several people were trying to be recognized to make a motion, that he had to go to me first and the majority leader second before he went to anybody else, so that you could close debate or do whatever the parliamentary maneuver you wanted to do. So they were awesome rules to take away power from a Democratic lieutenant governor. But I could not preside because the Constitution said he presided. I substituted for him, and we had as good a relationship as you could expect in that situation.
Mm-hmm. We have what we call game changers, which I refer to frequently in my conversations with great Georgians. And one of the great game changers in our political history was the election of Sonny Perdue as governor over incumbent Roy Barnes. Tell us about that election.
Well, when I was minority leader, Republican leader, you could tell, particularly in a body the size of the state Senate, that there was a great deal of strain between the rural Democrats and the urban Democrats, and we did everything we could to wedge them, including pushing constitutional marriage, the ban on gay marriage in Georgia, knowing that would wedge the Democrats. But it was particularly evident between the pro tem Sonny Perdue and the majority leader Charles Walker. Sonny was presiding at one point, and I just sat down next to him during the debate. Said, "Have you ever thought about changing parties?" And he looked over at me and says, "Yes, I have." And that was not what I was expecting. And all of a sudden, oh my gosh, now what do I do? I felt like the dog that caught the car. We were in the middle of the session. And so he and I had a brief conversation about we got to keep this really quiet because he was serious. So I went to Johnny Isakson to sort of mediate, who at the time was in Congress, to sort of mediate, all right, how are we going to handle this thing? And the way we had planned to do it was after the session, Sonny was going to get 6 senators that were conservative Democrats, friends of his, to switch parties and give us the majority. And word leaked out. I think it was Tim Golden in Valdosta. That's who we always suspected. Word leaked out, and of course, all hell came down on the Democrats from Zell Miller and Pierre Howard, and everybody ran for the cover. And Sonny, unfortunately, couldn't be involved in trying to hold him because his father was in ICU in Macon. So anyway, he kept his word, and he switched parties and went from the president pro tem to being a punished party switcher. Normally you don't lose your committee assignments, but they stripped him of his committees. That was the whole crime. When we protested, Mark Taylor said the famous Crimea River. But it was good for Sonny Perdue because he saw life in the minority. He saw the strong arm of power, and he earned his stripe as a Republican. And then as we started looking for somebody to run against Roy Barnes after redistricting, which is probably a whole other story we'll get into. We went to Tom Price, and Sonny and I went to Johnny Isakson, and he wouldn't take on his fellow Cobb County, and I'm sure he didn't think he could win, but there was also that relationship that they have. So finally, Sonny said, "I'm going to do it." And we had Linda Shrinko, him and the Cobb County Commission chairman in that race.
Yeah.
And the Senate all backed Sonny. And the party ended up nominating Sonny. And if he hadn't have switched parties and he hadn't been punished and he hadn't proven that he was a real Republican, real conservative Republican through that, he would not have won that nomination, much less been elected governor.
So the idea when he switched was not for him to run for governor?
No, sir.
You made that decision later.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And I was with him. It was sincere. I mean, we tried to get other people to run, more senior Republicans, more recognizable Republicans. And Sonny was in those meetings, and we were turned down by everybody we talked to.
So following his inauguration, which I believe was in 2003, mm-hmm. there were party switchers which gave you the majority in the Senate.
On victory night, and I remember flying up with my wife that night, it was the roughest airplane ride I can get. And we still weren't sure Sonny was winning. It was closer than the Mattingly-Talmadge race, but I was flying up to Atlanta assuming I was going to have another big disappointment. And of course, he won, and I went down to his victory suite several times that night, but the next morning we had a meeting, and he had a white chalkboard like that, and the first thing on there was take the Senate. That was his first to-do list. And so we got on the phone, and he and Tom Price and I borrowed 2 private planes over the next 2 weeks and hop-skipped around Georgia and switched 5 or 6 senators so that when Sonny was inaugurated, we had the Senate when we were inaugurated. We didn't win it on election day. We convinced conservative Democrats, and that was the rural Democrats were conservative, and the Democratic Party had left them, and they were more comfortable as Republicans, but they were afraid to do it until Sonny was elected. And so at that point, they were going to they were going to stay in the majority, people like Jack Hill, Dan Lee, Ed Boshier, I can't remember all of them. But Rooney Bowen, all switched and gave us the majority.
Good.
Augusta.
Bill Jackson?
No. Not Boshiers. White hair, died 7 or 8 years ago. Anyway, we did fine. We flew on a plane and have a press conference all around the state, and then that's when we started working on the rules change.
Had you noticed over the years that more and more distant Democratic voters were voting Republican?
That you could see it at the national level. I mean, we were voting for president and not for the local sheriff. So you could tell they wanted to go. They were basically, you could tell they were conservative, but they didn't identify with the Republican Party. The social, I was party chairman when we had the '88 Pat Robertson, George H.W. Bush fight, and that was really where the social conservatives came in against what Trump would call the establishment now, and through brutal convention procedures, the establishment controlled the process, but the Robertson social conservatives never went away. They learned the rules. So we'll see what happens with the Trump people this year. But that was when we began to marry. 80 and 88 were when we began to marry the rural conservative, pro-gun, pro-life, with the Republican suburbs.
Mm-hmm. Crimea River.
Mark Taylor, yeah, he could not believe that he lost the Senate. He was finally got to be lieutenant governor, lost the Senate, and then was stripped of all the power that he thought he was going to have. But he, after we took over, and again, it was awkward. We'd go down to his office every morning and basically tell him what we were doing, politely, respectfully. But he kept a good game face on. And like I say, we had a fairly good relationship, even in that situation.
Well, that to me begs the question, should Georgia require voters to register by party?
I'll leave that to other people. Every time you try to manipulate the system, it backfires on you. You can't run for 2 offices at once, and then you have to be a supermajority not to have a runoff, and redistricting, we're going to play all these games. So, every time you try to manipulate the system to make it benefit you or your party, it'll generally backfire. So I don't care.
Well, we had a situation there that also brought to my mind another question. Should the governor and the lieutenant governor run on the same ticket?
That might make some sense, since that's the number 2 slot. Something happens to the governor. But you're really just electing a person to preside over the Senate, unlike the Vice President of the United States, who has the same role. So, maybe that might be something to consider.
Well, you've written an interesting and I think very compelling history of the Georgia Republican Party, entitled "The Georgia Republican Party: 150 Years to Victory. I read it, and I heartily recommend that everyone who is interested in Georgia political history should read it. It's not in book form, but I have been advised by my mentor, Christian Lopez, that it has been published, which means that you can get it on the internet. Let's talk about the birth and growth of the Georgia Republican Party. V.O. Key Jr., who I'm sure you've heard of, he's a very well-known political writer, Southern particularly. He wrote that in 1950, of the 12 members of Congress from the former Southern states, just 2 were Republican. He wrote that in 1950. Today, the vast majority of congressmen and state officials are Republican. Is there a way to explain the rapid growth of the Republican Party in the South?
It preceded me a little bit, but I imagine it's a little bit similar to the same experience I went through with the conservative rural Democrats switching at the national level. Of course, that race is probably always a part of the South, and the Republicans through Lincoln were the party for the blacks. And somebody told me, I've never checked it out, that Richard Nixon got the majority of the black votes in his election. So they were still as late as '68 voting for Republicans, and it wasn't until probably Goldwater, no, that would have been '68. It wasn't until maybe Nixon's reelection, Ford, Reagan, that they began to play up to the conservatives in the South, and the African Americans began to realign, and the whites began to realign, and so I'm assuming that's what caused the switch at the national level, and the whole civil rights issue, the Vietnam War, Kennedy. You know, there was just a lot of pressure on white conservatives that the Democratic Party McGovern, was not the party they grew up with. It wasn't Roosevelt, it wasn't Truman, it was a different party, and the Republicans took a while. I mean, we all sort of get raised in a family and brought up to believe certain things in a certain household, and they may not like the Democrats, but we're not going to be Republicans. So it took a while to kind of get over that, I think.
What was Operation Breakthrough?
That was John Linder ran that program, and that was the beginning of, we're going to start targeting specific races, and we're going to find vulnerable seats, recruit a candidate, and try to get enough money to get them elected. Jack Kingston was involved with that too. So that was a John Linder, and Bob Irvin was involved with that too. I remember that was when I was in my early days in Savannah.
1964, big election, Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson. Georgia voted for Goldwater very strongly. At that point, how did the Georgia Republican Party interface with the National Party?
I guess they were aligning more comfortably now that they finally had a conservative who spoke their language running at the top of the ticket. So obviously I don't know the party relations at the time. Bo Calloway, I guess, was a congressman in '66, turned into his race for governor. My father-in-law was involved back then. Joe Tribble was a senator from Savannah, one of those one vote contested Senate elections. I think same year as L. Miller had his. So I can't tell you with the party apparatus, but I think Goldwater may have started the movement south for Republicans, then Nixon, then Ford and Reagan.
Well, Goldwater was instrumental in Bo Calloway being elected to Congress, who was the first Republican congressman from Georgia since Rufus Bullock was governor in 18 whatever. But he only served that one term, and then he ran for governor.
Mm-hmm.
And that the interesting thing to me, and I think this is another one of those game changers that I referred to in Georgia politics. The Republican candidate got the most votes, but lost the election.
Write-in candidate, if I remember correctly. And that may have helped the party continue to grow by seeing what a one-party rule could do. Mm-hmm. Even if you voted for somebody, that didn't mean they win. So somebody was manipulating the rules of the process. So
right.
That may have helped the party continue to grow.
Right. Let's review that. It was a strong, very strong Democratic field that featured a former governor and Lester Maddox, who had been a candidate for statewide office, and Ellis Arnold, who had been governor. And the Democratic nominee turned out to be Maddox. And Calloway was the Republican opponent. And Calloway outpolled Maddox.
Mm-hmm. But Ellis Arnold was a write-in candidate.
There was a group known as I don't remember the name now, but a write-in candidacy for Ellis Arnold, which threw it in the United States Supreme Court. Now the interesting.
It didn't throw it into the legislature.
Well, the Supreme Court
gave it to the legislature.
Had to rule that the legislature indeed had the constitutional power to elect a governor, which also is very interesting to me because that was the first time in my review that the Supreme Court had ever entered into a local election case. So the Supreme Court ruled that the legislature did in fact have the power to elect the governor, and they elected Maddox over Calloway. You think that strengthened the party?
I think so. Although the Maddox, I think I met him. He was still alive, but there were Maddox supporters that I met. So he was a conservative Democrat, and he still had his network out there. But my guess is that when they put somebody else in office that the voters hadn't elected, that probably strengthened, or at least firmed up the backbone of the Republican Party to the extent that they had one.
Now, getting
Bo
back,
Calloway stayed involved for years, ran for the Senate in Colorado, and funded the GOPAC with Newt Gingrich. It was another young guns Republican recruitment training tool. Still exists, but it was really active under Bo and Newt.
He also served as Secretary of the Army in the Ford administration, which I thought was very, very interesting also. Getting back now to your book on the growth of the Republican Party.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get into something I know about.
Well, we get
not just wrote about.
Yeah. Now that we're up to the point where we're reaching the 1970s, which actually were not the best of years for the Republican.
Watergate didn't help any.
Right.
Having Jimmy Carter on the ballot twice didn't help us grow. Georgia was the last state in the country to elect a Republican governor. And I always said it was Jimmy Carter hurt us the two best years we had, and Tom Murphy hated Republicans and controlled redistricting, and then Watergate.
You know, with all due respect to you, and the Republican Party. I was informed by a student on the campus of Young Harris College that Georgia has yet to elect a Republican governor, that the two governors who are Republicans who were elected were both former Democrats.
Well, a lot of us in the South were former Democrats, particularly in that generation that's a little bit older than I am. So,
Yeah.
And you mentioned me being out of state. You know, Mattingly thinks that was the turning point in his campaign when Talmadge called him a carpetbagger because there were so many new people moving into Georgia.
Yeah, that's a very interesting demographic, too. The ingrowth. I was just reading today that Georgia got another 195,000 residents over the past year. Those residents are going to become active in
Well,
politics.
you look at, we're skipping ahead, but you look at the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and it was Cobb and Gwinnett and Cherokee and Hall, and those aren't native Georgians. Those are all come here working in the Atlanta metro area.
I was mentioning earlier to the folks here that I had read where the original Republican Party in Georgia following Reconstruction was composed mostly of freed slaves and people from the North Georgia mountains
That opposed secession.
that opposed secession. And being a native of the North Georgia mountains, born and bred, I never knew that.
Mm-hmm.
I have heard stories about, you know, most of the people being pro-union, but I had never equated that with politics.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, all that has changed now. Most of Georgia is solidly Republican.
Mm-hmm.
All of our state office holders, constitutional officers, are Republicans. Most of our county commissioners are Republicans. Is that a good thing?
Well, I'd like to think that particularly those of us that went through the transition learned not to overplay your hand. I do worry that I see people that that haven't served in the minority, like Sonny Perdue did, and those of us like Jack Kingston and Bob Linder, John Linder, and Newt Gingrich and people like that you appreciate power more when it's used against you than when you've born and bred with it. And we may be getting to the point where, I worry about the Republicans maintaining the majority now. One of the reasons I ended up in the lieutenant governor's race instead of retiring, which had been my intention, was watching what was going on to the House under Glenn Richardson and just a little bit of that, okay, it's our turn now, and it was scandals waiting to happen.
Yeah.
I thought we'd done a good job keeping the moral tenor in the Senate correct and avoiding controversy, and I wanted to sort of continue to try to be the wise old man. I mean, I don't mean that egotistically, but that was a motive to stay in to run for lieutenant governor, was try to avoid what they call the Peachtree fever.
Peachtree fever. Let's talk about Newt Gingrich. You were close to Newt. He became Speaker of the House. Tell us about his political career.
Well, I think he inspired a lot of Georgians, just like Reagan did a lot of young Republicans nationwide, because he was unafraid to speak truth to power, to be aggressive. He was good at articulating, still is very good at articulating positions that resonate and explaining conservative principles without being threatening or cruel or racial or the pejorative that we oftentimes get as conservatives. So, and he was reaching out and training and recruiting the minor leagues and building a bench one of the problems the Democrats have now is they don't have a bench. The Republicans got a big bench. And Newt was the one that started that. And he had some help with John Linder and Bob Irvin and that generation of younger Republicans. But Newt, when Tom Murphy redistricted him out and he just switched districts, and that people kind of like that fight in him.
Yeah. Let's talk about redistricting. I know that's one of your favorite subjects.
That 4 years when I was minority leader, we recruited very heavily because we could smell the victory coming. And we focused very hard on candidate recruitment. And in 2000, this number is not going to be right, but it's going to be very close. We came within 2,200 votes of taking the Senate. Very close races in Athens and in Valdosta. And so with like 5 or 6 seats with 100 here, 27 here, I mean, we lost some really close races. And I remember just weeping on the back steps of the Republican Party headquarters about 2 in the morning when I realized all that effort that we had done, and it didn't quite pay off. Well, the Democrats paid attention. Roy Barnes and Bobby Kahn, going into the census and redistricting after the 2000 election, thought they were smarter than everybody else and drew extremely gerrymandered districts. Thought that the courts would allow them to deviate by 5% from an equal-sized district, so they packed Republicans into 5% oversize, and then Democrats into undersized districts. My district went from the South Carolina line to the Florida line. You couldn't even walk my district. I had to get in a boat. So that was to take every Republican on the coast and pack them into one district. That was their theory. And then in the House, of course, they did multi-member districts. It was brutal. That was I spread crime scene tape across the back of the Senate and got gavelled down by the lieutenant governor for doing that when they passed it. We tried to filibuster that vote as best we could under the Senate rules. I think it took 10, 12 hours for them to win that vote. And the interesting thing is, if you'll remember, Roy Barnes had the Education Reform A+ Act. He'd had the flag issue, and he had redistricting, and everybody thought the flag beat him. I'm convinced, and Sonny Perdue is convinced too, that redistricting did more harm to him than the other two. That all across this state, they disrupted relationships and who was representing who, and somebody in Waycross was all of a sudden in a congressional district in Augusta. I mean, it was ridiculous. So then when Sonny won and we took the Senate, we immediately challenged the redistricting. We now were in a position to raise money, so we could hire lawyers. It raised a lot of money for the party. The senators were contributing out of their campaign accounts. House was, of course, still in Democratic hands. And I think I was the third plaintiff. We found a private citizen to be the plaintiff. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. Came back down to a 3-judge panel. 3-judge panel ordered the legislature to redraw the districts, that they were illegal. The Supreme Court ruled that you had to be virtually zero on your deviation between sizes, which helped us. We always said that if you did that in fair districts, we'd win. And they also threw out multi-member districts. Well, the 3-judge panel said, all right, legislature, you get the opportunity to redraw districts. Well, of course, the Republican majority in the Senate drew fair district lines, sent it over to the House. They wouldn't vote on it. The House couldn't pass anything. So we adjourned a special session with no new districts, and the judges drew the new maps. And in 2004, we ran under those maps, and the House went Republican.
Mm-hmm. By a large margin. Mm-hmm. Was it 96?
Yeah, 91's a majority. So they took it, and Glenn Richardson became the first speaker. Mm-hmm. He'd been the, was he the minority? You had Jerry Keene and Glenn Richardson, but Glenn became the first. Lynn Westmoreland was the minority leader when I was running the Senate the first year. He was a minority leader, and then he decided to run for Congress, and Glenn moved up to speaker.
Right. Another one of those game changers that I like to refer to was the election of Paul Coverdell to the United States Senate. That was, I think, you could say, somewhat of an upset.
The first one, Mattingly rode the Reagan coattails, and then in the off year got beat in '86, but Coverdell was the first one to run and hold it, and what a gentleman he was, and respected statewide. He had built personal wealth, and he had wealthy friends that helped fund that kind of race for him. I never saw it, but I'm told he would mow his grass wearing a tie. I mean, he was that kind of guy.
He had a very strong following in the Atlanta area of voters of both parties. Everybody liked him.
One of the first things we did when we took control of both houses was name this building after him.
Well,
he just died after, and he'd been Peace Corps under Bush.
Well named. Okay, now let's get down to the situation where you are thinking about higher office.
Yeah, I was after 4 years basically of being lieutenant governor, and then Casey Cagle is elected lieutenant governor. I give voluntarily, and over the objection of some Republican senators, I might add, gave the power back to Casey. We talked about that earlier. I think that there needs to be a presiding officer, and that's he was a Republican and one of us, so he had earned it. And I don't think people realized how difficult it was to have the power that I had with a job in Savannah and limited staff, and so I maintained pro tem for 2 more years, and then said I was going to retire in 2 more years, and I think I did 1 year as ethics chairman, and then just sort of demoted myself to something, and then was planning on heading home. Casey said he was going to run for governor that year, and I decided that I virtually had been lieutenant governor. Maybe I could do the real job now, but was encouraged by a lot of people to seek it. Started that campaign for about a year. Resigned early. Left the Senate in the middle of the term, right after whatever year it was, right after the session, and spent a year running for lieutenant governor. And that was the Tea Party year. I had just gone to a Tea Party rally, and that was the Tea Party starting year. I'd just gone to a Tea Party rally in Macon, and I got a call as I was leaving from Casey saying that he had back issues, spinal, of course, serious back issues, and he was going to have to drop out of the governor's race and run for re-election as lieutenant governor. So I had a big decision to make, which was, do I just go ahead and retire? Because I just wasn't going to run against an incumbent lieutenant governor. While we weren't close friends, we were friends, and that would have been a tough race. But after having run statewide for a year, I had built up a network. I had built up some of self-confidence that maybe I could do this. And at the time, you had Oxendine in the race and Handel in the race. Both, I thought, Oxendine had plenty of baggage, and Handel I still thought was over. Just wasn't quite up to the job. I'll put it that way. And then rumors of Nathan getting in the race, and I didn't know Nathan, but in the Tea Party year, an ex-Democrat had raised taxes, but party switcher just didn't ring like that was the threat that he ended up being, and of course ended up in 2% behind Nathan and finished third. We had 7 people in that primary, and finished in 3rd place and went home. So. But I'm glad I did it. It's a big, beautiful state. There are parts of it I'd never seen before, other than flying in and out, do a fundraiser for a senator. What I call the West Coast of Georgia, the Chattahoochee side is just part of state I'd never gotten to know. So it was, I don't want to recommend everybody running statewide, but if you have the opportunity, don't turn it down. You get to know a lot of people.
Were you surprised that Nathan won that race?
Yes, yep. I just assumed Karen Handel because it wasn't very close between. But he and I were close in second and third, but she would have a pretty good margin. I don't remember what it was, but 40 in the 40s, I think. So it looked pretty strong, and she had the Purdue people behind her. But my folks, I had a lot of that South Georgia coastal folks, and they all went with Nathan, and so there was kind of a coalition formed that I think helped him. And nobody had really attacked Karen hard, but they made the campaign decision to go negative. I have never run a negative ad in all my races, and if I'd ended up in the runoff with her, I don't know whether I'd have gone negative, and if I hadn't, I probably would have lost. But they went after her pretty strong, and then the South Georgia, East Georgia, North Georgia beat Metro Atlanta.
It was a close race, though. As a matter of fact, as I recall, she was within a distance to ask for a recount.
Yep.
And she didn't. Why wouldn't she?
I don't know if she. I think she could have asked for. There's a required 1% and 2%. So she was close, but I don't know. I don't remember. It was close enough. I don't know if it was. Yeah.
A few thousand votes.
I guess she was advised. I've never seen a race turn around in a recount. Usually, it's 1 or 2 or 3 votes is all you find.
Right. No recount. So you learned a lot from your race for governor, and you went home. What happened then?
When you get out of politics. And I've talked to Tommy Williams recently. Don Balfour and I've had this conversation. You don't miss the ugly side. You don't miss the people that lie to you. You don't miss the egos. You don't miss the folks that come to town with something else to do on their mind. What you really miss is ability to help people. To pick up the phone and help somebody get the driver's license renewed that's bogged down, or something, curb cut for the business they're starting. You miss that ability, but you don't. There's a side, and it's not as, when we took over, people say you did such a great job, and I said first I was in the right place at the right time. But when we took over, we had sort of mainstream, easy conservative stuff to do. We did tort reform, we did ethics reform, we did some education reform. I did my special needs voucher for kids. Now it's, how far to the right you can go and how far to the left you can go. So it's all of the mainstream stuff has been done. So and everybody's so worried about the primaries that nobody worries about working with the other party. And I don't miss that. I fear Atlanta's becoming like Washington, where it's just us against them, and the us is divided on both sides. I mean, we're seeing it on the Democratic side too.
Let's talk about the Tea Party. Is the Tea Party actually a part of the Republican Party, or is it a detriment to the Republican Party?
Well, let me define the Tea Party as it started was real people with no organization mad at the system, and that was a good thing, a real revolution. That first couple of elections, they were a benefit to conservative candidates. Then you started getting people using it as their own mouthpiece, getting paid for it. So you've got the Tea Party of North Georgia, you got the Tea Party of Gwinnett County, you got the Patriots down here, and they don't have any real clout because the real Tea Party people don't want leaders. That's what, So I think it's not the Tea Party that's the problem. It's the 70 and 80% Republican districts where there's always somebody angry and there's always somebody in a primary. That if I could change anything, and I told my team when we went through redistricting, You don't want to be in an over. You want to be in a marginal Republican. You want to be a 55, 60% Republican. You don't want to be 75. Then you're the incumbent going against the other party, and you're not really challenged from the right. And I don't know how to fix redistricting, but I think that's part of the problem. The Democrats have the same problem. You know, how are we going to do the minimum wage, or are we going to ban guns? You know, it's when everybody's worried about which team they're on, and you have a team fight, it's hard to work with the other team. And we still have my big issue is education reform, and I still that's going to have to be. Look at Nathan struggling with it. That's going to have to be a bipartisan effort. Fix public education in this state.
As you look back over your career, of what are you most proud?
I have two things. The first is, and I think I was an active role in flipping this state, of going from the minority to the majority, putting the right people on the bus, avoiding scandal, and leaving office with my integrity intact and the respect that I didn't get drugged down. I still hear positives from the time in leadership, and that's no easy task. And we saw what went on in the House side when we flipped. Legislatively, I'm the most proud of Georgia's only voucher program, the special needs voucher. I still believe in vouchers for education, just like it's built a best university system in the country and this state. That we're going to have to let the money follow the child if we're going to reform public education. And I went in with a special needs program, and it ended up passing by one vote on sine die, and the speaker had to cast the deciding vote on sine die, and I'll never forget Glenn Richardson for that. So legislatively, that's my biggest plus, but just helping change the majority of this state and governing with integrity.
Any regrets?
No, I mean, no. Little things here and there, but nothing big. I did not endorse Nathan, although I encouraged my people actively to support him, and they did. But I was worried about what I was reading in the papers about Washington, which turned out to be not. I tell people truly that if I had known Nathan Deal beforehand, I might not have gotten in that race. But all I saw was this image of this old ex-Democrat under ethics investigation. So, but I think he's got a good heart, good mind, is a good leader. And I might not have even stayed in that race if I'd known him as a person. So the only regret is that maybe I didn't help him more openly. I helped him behind the scenes, and he's been good to me.
You think he's on the right road toward educational improvement?
Well, that was the other reason that I stayed in that race, was because I was so passionate about vouchers and education reform. And his wife was a teacher. His next door neighbor was the school superintendent. And I didn't see him as a reformer in education, but he has impressed me with where he's gone with charter schools, with opportunity schools, and now trying to redo a QBE formula, which is a tough task. Mm-hmm. He's done some things that I wouldn't have done as a non-lawyer. His justice reform. So he's done different things. We have different skill sets and different backgrounds, but I think he's done a good job. And the basic Georgia governor, don't rock the boat too much model.
Well, you're still a young man. Got many years ahead. Are you really through with politics?
Yeah, I joke. I moved up to Effingham County. I joke I might run for mayor of Guyton, but no. I have a role now where I try to mentor people when asked, to take care of that public service. I'm on 6 or 7 boards, so trying to produce a little bit of wisdom and knowledge and how Atlanta works. I do a little bit of government. My primary job is architecture and principal and engineering firm, but I am tied to McGuire Woods, so I do some government affairs work, which keeps my fingers in the Capitol a little bit. Don't show up much here, but it's more about advice and opening doors. But do a little bit of government affairs work, and that's plenty. I got grandchildren now and a new farm in Effingham County that I wouldn't have had if I was living on West Paces Ferry. So God's in charge.
You know, I promised myself I wouldn't bring up this subject. What?
Maybe you shouldn't.
Why do you think the average American is so angry with their government?
Some of it's driven by this fragmentation of media. I don't want to blame all talk radio. I'm a big fan of both conservative talk radio, but they tend to be entertainers a lot of times. That's part of it. And part of it is certainly justified, that there's a frustration, particularly in Washington. They're not fixing immigration. They're not fixing taxes. They're not fixing entitlement programs that we all know are a big problem. We're still running deficits. So, no matter what party's in charge, I think there's an accurate frustration with the ruling class, and we bring it on ourselves. With politicians, every time there's one of our own crosses a line ethically or morally, it taints everybody. Even though I tell people, I saw very little corruption. I saw some immoral stuff that I didn't like, but very little corruption. Most people are trying to do a good job. They just have a different perspective of ideology of how to do it. I think that it's good to have folks angry. The other issue is the average voter doesn't realize the complexity of accomplishing anything in the legislative arena that our founding fathers set up to be hard to accomplish anything. A 60-vote majority in the Senate is almost impossible to get anything through, and even in Georgia, just having something past the Senate and something past the House, coming together to get every T crossed and I dotted, and then have the governor agree with it ain't easy when you have a 2/3 majority in both bodies like Republicans do now. So some of it they just don't realize the process, and they think everybody thinks like they do, and they don't. So I don't know where that's going to end, but hopefully what goes around comes around, and we'll get back to wanting to elect the Johnny Isaacsons and the Paul Coverdales of the world.
Mm-hmm. Who has had the biggest influence on your life?
My wife of 41 years has had a big influence in a good spiritual, calming, new Eric way. Politically, Reagan, Mattingly, Gingrich, Kingston. I've been close to Jack, and I were, basically best friends ever since we met. So that would be it.
Maybe I shouldn't ask this, but if you were asked to name one political figure for whom you have the most respect, who would it be?
I'm a big history buff, and I love our founding fathers, and all of them had their flaws. But just the George Washington that voluntarily gave up power, the John Adams who, defended the redcoats in a trial, and his foreign affairs. Those were men, and the women that supported them at the time, that put their country first. And so any public servant now that's willing to make the hard vote and do what's right regardless of the consequences has my respect. One of my lines in speeches is that politicians need to be thinking about the next generation and not the next election, and there are all too few of them. And I think that's the only issue that I flip-flop on, and that's term limits. That I used to be for them, and then I realized that it takes a decade to understand QBE and how the system works. But now I'm beginning to think that maybe that there's a time at the end of your career where you'd like to vote like you really want to vote, and on some of these issues that are tough. I mean, look, Social Security, Medicare are going bankrupt. Everybody knows it. All they have to do, and everybody knows how to fix it. But we'll do it after the election, or we'll do it next year, or we'll do it when the new president comes in. That's why you have the Tea Party and the Bernie Sanders of the world. They're just, they just won't do what they know needs to get done. Mm-hmm. And our founding fathers did.
Well, you've had a very full and rewarding life. Anything left on your bucket list?
Love to travel, stay healthy. I just, even though I'm still relatively young at 62 and blessed with good health, I look back on a career with pride. I don't have any regrets. It's even losing my only election, I have absolutely no regrets of what I've done. You go back into, we didn't talk about the flag. Go back into the flag debate, and I fought Roy Barnes tooth and nail. Even though I knew the flag should be changed, if you'll read my speech, it was not this way, not this flag, and that secret, that the way he did it in secret, and then that Denny's placemat ugly flag that he rolled out. I ended up voting for the flag we have now and had posters printed out. But that was one that I don't know if I had to vote again, whether I would have done it or not. I think it was time. And Barnes should get credit for raising that issue and getting it done. But I didn't like the way he did it at all. And as an architect, the aesthetics in me, that was a god-awful flag.
Well, thank you so much for coming up and being with us today. Is there anything we missed?
No, sir. Just you and I have been around this Gold Dome for a long time. We need people to realize that this is an important job, and that you don't do it for the money. You don't do it because it's going to help your career. It's certainly not going to help your family life. But it's a ministry, and people need to be engaged in it. That somebody needs to do it. And I think the biggest compliment that I always got was people would thank me for just doing it. You go back home to Savannah, thank you, Eric, for doing that. So I don't have to do it, or somebody worse would have to do it. So I always am trying to recruit candidates, careful not to sound like need to run against an incumbent, but get it from school board to city council to county commissions to state legislatures. I mean, get involved. I have never, being party leader, minority leader, and president pro tem, I've recruited a lot of candidates, and never, ever have I met a candidate regretted running. They don't like losing, but they don't regret running and getting involved in that democratic process and the people you meet and the issues you learn. And, so I wish more people would get involved, and we'd have more contested races. That might help us fix some of our problems too.